Hello there, how are you? I hope everyone is very well. I saw Yareli Crafts and Mel Fly up first again. Thank you both very much for joining me so regularly. I really appreciate you coming along and joining me as I do Fireside Readings. My name is Gildart Jackson. I'm an actor, I read audiobooks, and as you all know, I've started Fireside Readings, which I thoroughly enjoy doing. It's an opportunity for me to connect in a modern way with you and give you something that I hope you enjoy. A little reading in front of the fire, just like they did in the old days. We're currently reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. We've read I think 5 other books: Great Expectations, A Sherlock Holmes, A Jeeves and Wooster, The Awakening, and Dracula. And they're all on the YouTube channel Fireside Reading. And if you're new here, please check them out if you'd like. Benjamin Franklin wrote his autobiography in several different parts at different stages of his life, and they were sort of put together after he died. We're in the middle of the third of 4 parts, but it's quite long, so I'm calling it the 3rd chapter, and this is part 5 of the 3rd chapter. He has set off on an excursion with part of the English army that has come there. I'm afraid the English are the baddies in this particular scenario. Although I'm an American now, so I can understand our point of view, if you see what I mean. So he set off, and they're just about to make camp. He helped them get wagons, and he's a very interesting chap. Some of his opinions are not necessarily things that I or we really agree with anymore. But a lot of what he did, starting the first fire brigade, the first post office, the first library, really amazing. His industry was amazing. So, welcome to a fireside reading of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, Part 5 of Chapter 3. While I was at the camp, supping one evening with the officers of Colonel Dunbar's regiment, he presented to me his concern for the subalterns, who, he said, were generally not in affluence and could ill afford, in this dear country, to lay in the stores that might be necessary in so long a march through a wilderness where nothing was to be purchased. I commiserated their case and resolved to endeavor procuring them some relief. I said nothing, however, to him of my intention, but wrote the next morning to the committee of the Assembly, who had the disposition of some public money, warmly recommending the case of these officers to their consideration, and proposing that a present should be sent them of necessaries and refreshments. My son, who had some experience of a camp life and of its wants, drew up a list for me, which I enclosed in my letter. The committee approved and used such diligence that, conducted by my son, the stores arrived at the camp as soon as the wagons. They consisted of 20 parcels, each containing 6 pounds loaf sugar, 1 Gloucester cheese, 6 pounds good muscovado, 1 keg containing 20 pounds good butter, 1 pound good green tea, a dozen old Madeira wine, 2 dozen old Madeira wine, I beg their pardon, 2 dozen old Madeira wine, 1 pound good bohea, 2 gallons Jamaica spirits, 6 pounds good ground coffee, 1 bottle flour of mustard, 6 pounds chocolate, 2 well-cured hams, 1 to 2 quarts of best white biscuit, 1 to 2 dozen dry tongues, 1 to 2 pounds of pepper, 6 pounds of rice, 1 quart best white wine, 6 pounds raisins, vinegar. These 20 parcels, well packed, were placed on as many horses, each parcel with the horse being intended as a present for one officer. They were very thankfully received, and the kindness acknowledged by letters to me from the colonels of both regiments in the most grateful terms. The general, too, was highly satisfied with my conduct in procuring him the wagons, etc., and readily paid my account of disbursements, thanking me repeatedly and requesting my farther assistance in sending provisions after him. I undertook this also, and was busily employed in it till we heard of his defeat, advancing for the service of my own money upwards of £1,000 sterling, of which I sent him an account. It came to his hands, luckily for me, a few days before the battle, and he returned me immediately an order on the paymaster for the round sum of £1,000, leaving the remainder to the next account. I consider this payment as good luck, having never been able to obtain that remainder, of which more hereafter. This general was, I think, a brave man, and might probably have made a figure as a good officer in some European war, but he had too much self-confidence, too high an opinion of the validity of regular troops, and too mean a one of both Americans and Indians. George Croghan, our Indian interpreter, joined him on his march with 100 of those people who might have been of great use to his army as guides, scouts, etc., if he had treated them kindly, but he slighted and neglected them, and they gradually left him. In conversation with him one day, he was giving me some account of his intended progress. After taking Fort Duquesne, says he, I am to proceed to Niagara, and having taken that to Frontenac, if the season will allow time, and I suppose it will, for Duquesne can hardly detain me over 3 or 4 days, and then I see nothing that can obstruct my march to Niagara. Having before revolved in my mind the long line his army must make in their march by a very narrow road to be cut for them through the woods and bushes, and also what I had read of a former defeat of 1,500 French who invaded the Iroquois country, I had conceived some doubts and some fears for the event of the campaign. But I ventured only to say, to be sure, if you arrive well before Duquesne, with these fine troops, so well provided with artillery, that place not yet completely fortified, and, as we hear, with no very strong garrison, can probably make but a short resistance. The only danger I apprehend of obstruction to your march is from ambuscades of Indians, who, by constant practice, are dexterous in laying and executing them, and the slender line, near 4 miles long, which your army must make, may expose it to be attacked by surprise in its flanks, and to be cut like a thread into several pieces, which from their distance cannot come up in time to support each other. He smiled at my ignorance and replied, These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia. But upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make any impression. I was conscious of an impropriety in my disputing with a military man in matters of his profession, and said no more. The enemy, however, did not take the advantage of his army, which I apprehended its long line of march exposed it to, but let it advance without interruption till within 9 miles of the place. And then, when more in a body, for it had just passed a river where the front had halted till all were come over, and in a more open part of the woods than any it had passed, attacked its advanced guard by a heavy fire from behind trees and bushes, which was the first intelligence the general had of an enemy's being near him. The guard being disordered, the general hurried the troops up to their assistance, which was done in great confusion, through wagons, baggage, and cattle. And presently the fire came upon their flank. The officers, being on horseback, were more easily distinguished, picked out as marks, and fell very fast. And the soldiers were crowded together in a huddle, having or hearing no orders and standing to be shot at till 2/3 of them were killed. And then, being seized with a panic, the whole fled with precipitation. The wagoners took each a horse out of his team and scampered. Their example was immediately followed by others, so that all the wagons, provisions, artillery, and stores were left to the enemy. The general, being wounded, was brought off with difficulty. His secretary, Mr. Shirley, was killed by his side. And out of 86 officers, 63 were killed or wounded, and 714 men killed out of 1,100. These 1,100 had been picked men from the whole army. The rest had been left behind with Colonel Dunbar, who was to follow with the heavier part of the stores, provisions, and baggage. The flyers, not being pursued, arrived at Dunbar's camp, and the panic they brought with them instantly seized him and all his people. And though he had now above 1,000 men, and the enemy who had beaten Braddock did not at most exceed 400 Indians and French together, instead of proceeding and endeavoring to recover some of the lost honor, he ordered all the stores, ammunition, etc., to be destroyed, that he might have more horses to assist his flight towards the settlements and less lumber to remove. He was there met with requests from the governors of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania that he would post his troops on the frontiers so as to afford some protection to the inhabitants, but he continued his hasty march through all the country, not thinking himself safe till he arrived at Philadelphia, where the inhabitants could protect him. This whole transaction gave us Americans the first suspicion that our exalted ideas of the prowess of British regulars had not been well founded. In their first march, too, from their landing till they got beyond the settlements, they had plundered and stripped the inhabitants, totally ruining some poor families, besides insulting, abusing, and confining the people if they remonstrated. This was enough to put us out of conceit of such defenders, if we had really wanted any. How different was the conduct of our French friends in 1781, who, during a march through the most inhabited part of our country, from Rhode Island to Virginia, near 700 miles, occasioned not the smallest complaint for the loss of a pig, a chicken, or even an apple. Captain Orme, who was one of the general's aides-de-camp, and being grievously wounded, was brought off with him and continued with him to his death, which happened in a few days, told me that he was totally silent all the first day, and at night only said, "Who would have thought it?" That he was silent again the following day, saying only at last, "We shall better know how to deal with them another time," and died in a few minutes after. The secretary's papers, with all the general's orders, instructions, and correspondence, falling into the enemy's hands, they selected and translated into French a number of the articles which they printed to prove the hostile intentions of the British court before the declaration of war. Among these, I saw some letters of the general to the ministry, speaking highly of the great service I had rendered the army, and recommended me to their notice. David Hume, too, who was some years after secretary to Lord Hertford, when minister in France, and afterward to General Conway, when Secretary of State, told me he had seen among the papers in that office letters from Braddock highly recommending me. But the expedition having been unfortunate, my service, it seems, was not thought of much value, for those recommendations were never of any use to me. As to rewards from himself, I asked only one, which was that he would give orders to his officers not to enlist any more of our bought servants, and that he would discharge such as had already been enlisted. This he readily granted, and several were accordingly returned to their masters on my application. Dunbar, when the command devolved on him, was not so generous. He being at Philadelphia on his retreat, or rather flight, I applied to him for the discharge of the servants of 3 poor farmers of Lancaster County that he had enlisted, reminding him of the late General's orders on that head. He promised me that if the masters would come to him at Trenton, where he should be in a few days on his march to New York, he would there deliver their men to them. They accordingly were at the expense and trouble of going to Trenton, and there he refused to perform his promise, to their great loss and disappointment. As soon as the loss of the wagons and horses was generally known, all the owners came upon me for the valuation which I had given bond to pay. Their demands gave me a great deal of trouble, my acquainting them that the money was already in the paymaster's hands, but that orders for paying it must first be obtained from General Shirley, and my assuring them that I had applied to that general by letter, but he being at a distance, an answer could not soon be received, and they must have patience. All this was not sufficient to satisfy, and some began to sue me. General Shirley at length relieved me from this terrible situation by appointing commissioners to examine the claims and ordering payment. They amounted to near £20,000, which to pay would have ruined me. Before we had the news of this defeat, the 2 doctors Bond came to me with a subscription paper for raising money to defray the expense of a grand firework which it was intended to exhibit at a rejoicing on receipt of the news of our taking Fort Duquesne. I looked grave and said it would, I thought, be time enough to prepare for the rejoicing when we knew we should have occasion to rejoice. They seemed surprised that I did not immediately comply with their proposal. "Why the devil," says one of them, "you surely don't suppose that the fort will not be taken?" "I don't know that it will not be taken, but I know that the events of war are subject to great uncertainty." I gave them the reasons of my doubting. The subscription was dropped, and the projectors thereby missed the mortification they would have undergone if the firework had been prepared. Dr. Bond, on some other occasion afterward, said that he did not like Franklin's forebodings. Governor Morris, who had continually worried the Assembly with message after message before the defeat of Braddock, to beat them into the making of acts to raise money for the defense of the province without taxing, among others, the proprietary estates, and had rejected all their bills for not having such an exempting clause, now redoubled his attacks with more hope of success, the danger and necessity being greater. The Assembly, however, continued firm, believing they had justice on their side and that it would be giving up an essential right if they suffered the governor to amend their money bills. In one of the last, indeed, which was for granting £50,000, his proposed amendment was only of a single word. The bill expressed that all estates, real and personal, were to be taxed, those of the proprietaries not excepted. His amendment was, for not read only, a small but very material alteration. However, when the news of this disaster reached England, our friends there, whom we had taken care to furnish with all the Assembly's answers to the governor's messages, raised a clamour against the proprietaries for their meanness and injustice in giving their governor such instructions, some going so far as to say that by obstructing the defence of their province, they forfeited their right to it. They were intimidated by this and sent orders to their Receiver-General to add £5,000 of their money to whatever sum might be given by the Assembly for such purpose. This, being notified to the House, was accepted in lieu of their share of a general tax, and a new bill was formed with an exempting clause, which passed accordingly. By this act, I was appointed one of the commissioners for disposing of the money, £60,000. I had been active in modelling the bill and procuring its passage, and had at the same time drawn a bill for establishing and disciplining of a voluntary militia, which I carried through the House without much difficulty, as care was taken in it to leave the Quakers at their liberty. To promote the association necessary to form the militia, I wrote a dialogue stating and answering all the objections I could think of to such a militia, which was printed and had, as I thought, great effect. This dialogue and the Militia Act are in the Gentleman's Magazine for February and March 1756. While the several companies in the city and country were forming and learning their exercise, the governor prevailed with me to take charge of our northwestern frontier, which was infested by the enemy, and provide for the defense of the inhabitants by raising troops and building a line of forts. I undertook this military business, though I did not conceive myself well qualified for it. He gave me a commission with full powers and a parcel of blank commissions for officers to be given to whom I thought fit. I had but little difficulty in raising men, having soon 560 under my command. My son, who had in the preceding war been an officer in the army raised against Canada, was my aide-de-camp and of great use to me. The Indians had burned Gnadenhout, a village settled by the Moravians, and massacred the inhabitants, but the place was thought a good situation for one of the forts. In order to march thither, I assembled the companies at Bethlehem, the chief establishment of those people. I was surprised to find it in so good a posture of defense. The destruction of Gnadenhout had made them apprehend danger. The principal buildings were defended by a stockade. They had purchased a quantity of arms and ammunition from New York, and had even placed quantities of small paving stones between the windows of their high stone houses for their women to throw down upon the heads of any Indians that should attempt to force into them. The armed brethren, too, kept watch and relieved as methodically as in any garrison town. In conversation with the bishop, Spangenberg, I mentioned this my surprise, for knowing they had obtained an act of Parliament exempting them from military duties in the colonies, I had supposed they were conscientiously scrupulous of bearing arms. He answered me that it was not one of their established principles, but that at the time of their obtaining that act, it was thought to be a principle with many of their people. On this occasion, however, they, to their surprise, found it adopted by but a few. It seems they were either deceived in themselves or deceived the Parliament, but common sense, aided by present danger, will sometimes be too strong for whimsical opinions. It was the beginning of January when we set out upon this business of building forts. I sent one detachment toward the Minisink with instructions to erect one for the security of that upper part of the country, and another to the lower part with similar instructions. And I concluded to go myself with the rest of my force to Gnadenhout, where a fort was thought more immediately necessary. The Moravians procured me 5 wagons for our tools, stores, baggage, etc. Just before we left Bethlehem, 11 farmers who had been driven from their plantations by the Indians came to me requesting a supply of firearms that they might go back and fetch off their cattle. I gave them each a gun with suitable ammunition. We had not marched many miles before it began to rain, and it continued raining all day. There were no habitations on the road to shelter us till we arrived near night at the house of a German, where and in his barn we were all huddled together, as wet as water could make us. It was well we were not attacked in our march, for our arms were of the most ordinary sort, and our men could not keep their gun locks dry. The Indians are dexterous in contrivances for that purpose, which we had not. They met that day the 11 poor farmers above mentioned, and killed 10 of them. The one who escaped informed that his and his companions' guns would not go off, the priming being wet with the rain. The next day being fair, we continued our march and arrived at the desolated Gnadenhout. There was a sawmill there, round which were left several piles of boards, with which we soon hutted ourselves, an operation the more necessary at that inclement season, as we had no tents. Our first work was to bury more effectually the dead we found there, who had been half interred by the country people. The next morning our fort was planned and marked out, the circumference measuring 455 feet, which would require as many palisades to be made of trees, one with another, of a foot diameter each. Our axes, of which we had 70, were immediately set to work to cut down trees, and our men, being dexterous in the use of them, great dispatch was made. Seeing the trees fall so fast, I had the curiosity to look at my watch, when 2 men began to cut at a pine. In 6 minutes they had it upon the ground, and I found it of 14 inches diameter. Each pine made 3 palisades of 18 feet long, pointed at one end. While these were preparing, our other men dug a trench all round of 3 feet deep, in which the palisades were to be planted, and our wagons, the bodies being taken off and the fore and hind wheels separated by taking out the pin which united the 2 parts of the perch, we had 10 carriages with 2 horses each to bring the palisades from the woods to the spot. When they were set up, our carpenters built a stage of boards all round within, about 6 feet high, for the men to stand on when to fire through the loopholes. We had 1 swivel gun, which we mounted on one of the angles and fired it as soon as fixed, to let the Indians know, if any were within hearing, that we had such pieces. And thus our fort, if such a magnificent name may be given to so miserable a stockade, was finished in a week, though it rained so hard every other day that the men could not work. This gave me occasion to observe that when men are employed, they are best contented. For on the days they worked, they were good-natured and cheerful, and with the consciousness of having done a good day's work, they spent the evening jollily. But on our idle days, they were mutinous and quarrelsome, finding fault with their pork, the bread, etc., and in continual ill humour, which put me in mind of a sea captain whose rule it was to keep his men constantly at work. And when his mate once told him that they had done everything and there was nothing further to employ them about, "Oh," says he, "make them scour the anchor." This kind of thought, however contemptible, is a sufficient defense against Indians who have no cannon. Finding ourselves now posted securely and having a place to retreat to on occasion, we ventured out in parties to scour the adjacent country. We met with no Indians, but we found the places on the neighboring hills where they had lain to watch our proceedings. There was an art in their contrivance of those places that seems worth mention. It being winter, a fire was necessary for them, but a common fire on the surface of the ground would, by its light, have discovered their position at a distance. They had therefore dug holes in the ground about 3 feet diameter and somewhat deeper. We saw where they had, with their hatchets, cut off the charcoal from the sides of burnt logs lying in the woods. With these coals, they had made small fires in the bottom of the holes, and we observed among the weeds and grass the prints of their bodies, made by their lying all round with their legs hanging down in the holes to keep their feet warm, which, with them, is an essential point. This kind of fire, so managed, could not discover them, either by its light, flames, sparks, or even smoke. It appeared that their number was not great, and it seems they saw we were too many to be attacked by them with prospect of advantage. We had for our chaplain a zealous Presbyterian minister, Mr. Beatty, who complained to me that the men did not generally attend his prayers and exhortations. When they enlisted, they were promised, besides pay and provisions, a gill of rum a day, which was punctually served out to them, half in the morning and the other half in the evening. And I observed they were as punctual in attending to receive it, upon which I said to Mr. Beatty, "It is perhaps below the dignity of your profession to act as steward of the rum, but if you were to deal it out and only just after prayers, you would have them all about you." He liked the thought, undertook the office, and with the help of a few hands to measure out the liquor, executed it to satisfaction, and never were prayers more generally and more punctually attended. So that I thought this method preferable to the punishment inflicted by some military laws for non-attendance on divine service. I had hardly finished this business and got my fort well stored with provisions, when I received a letter from the governor acquainting me that he had called the assembly and wished my attendance there, if the posture of affairs on the frontiers was such that my remaining there was no longer necessary. My friends, too, of the assembly, pressing me by their letters to be, if possible, at the meeting, and my 3 intended forts being now completed, and the inhabitants contented to remain on their farms under that protection, I resolved to return, the more willingly as a New England officer, Colonel Clapham, experienced in Indian war, being on a visit to our establishment, consented to accept the command. I gave him a commission, and parading the garrison, had it read before them, and introduced him to them as an officer who, from his skill in military affairs, was much more fit to command them than myself, and, giving them a little exhortation, took my leave. I was escorted as far as Bethlehem, where I rested a few days to recover from the fatigue I had undergone. The first night being in a good bed, I could hardly sleep. It was so different from my hard lodging on the floor of our hut at Gnaden, wrapped only in a blanket or two. While at Bethlehem, I inquired a little into the practice of the Moravians. Some of them had accompanied me, and all were very kind to me. I found they worked for a common stock, ate at common tables, and slept in common dormitories, great numbers together. In the dormitories, I observed loopholes at certain distances all along, just under the ceiling, which I thought judiciously placed for change of air. I was at their church, where I was entertained with good music, the organ being accompanied with violins, hautboys, flutes, clarinets, etc. I understood that the sermons were not usually preached to mixed congregations of men, women, and children, as is our common practice, but that they assembled sometimes the married men, at other times their wives, then the young men, the young women, and the little children, each division by itself. The sermon I heard was to the latter, who came in and were placed in rows on benches, the boys under the conduct of a young man, their tutor, and the girls conducted by a young woman. The discourse seemed well adapted to their capacities and was delivered in a pleasing, familiar manner, coaxing them, as it were, to be good. They behaved very orderly, but looked pale and unhealthy, which made me suspect they were kept too much within doors or not allowed sufficient exercise. I inquired concerning the Moravian marriages, whether the report was true that they were by lot. I was told that lots were used only in particular cases, that generally, when a young man found himself disposed to marry, he informed the elders of his class, who consulted the elder ladies that governed the young women. As these elders of the different sexes were well acquainted with the tempers and dispositions of their respective pupils, they could best judge what matches were suitable, and their judgments were generally acquiesced in. But if, for example, it should happen that 2 or 3 young women were found to be equally proper for the young man, the lot was then recurred to. I objected if the matches were not made by the mutual choice of the parties. Some of them may chance to be very unhappy. And so they may, answered my informer, if you let the parties choose for themselves. Which indeed I could not deny. Thank you all for joining me. I hope this helps a little, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, same time, 5 Pacific, on Instagram at Fireside Reading. And do check out the YouTube channel, Fireside Reading too, if you'd like. Until then, please stay very well. Good night.